Welcome to a deep dive that's a little different than what we normally do. We're going to be looking at a podcast episode this time called The Weight of Glory, a reflective journey through Tuesday of Passion Week.
Ooh.
So the hosts of this podcast, Father John and Father d-Sawmo, lead listeners through this spiritual journey using readings and reflections and even Syriac chants, all tied to certain times throughout Passion Tuesday.
I love how they bring in those ancient languages and traditions to make Tuesday of Passion Week leading up to Easter come alive.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
It is. And they don't shy away from some complex theological concepts.
Right.
But that's why we're here to break it all down and explore some of the key themes for you.
Absolutely. We'll uncover some fascinating connections to history and language, and even how these ideas connect to our lives today. For instance, this episode dives deep into the concept of hypocrisy, using the Greek word hypokresis to describe the Pharisees. But it goes beyond just, outward pretense. It implies this deliberate attempt to deceive and manipulate for personal gain, which is something we still see today.
Yeah, it's a theme that really came through strongly for me while I was listening. The episode really zooms in on those tense interactions between Jesus and the Pharisees.
Right.
They're always trying to trap him with questions, like that whole tax dilemma. But Jesus, he knows they're cunning, and he kind of turns the tables on them in a pretty masterful way.
It's a brilliant example of how Jesus uses these confrontations to teach. When he says, "Render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's," he's not just being clever. The Greek word apodote, meaning render, suggests giving back what's owed.
Right.
Which makes you think, what do we truly owe to God?
I think, our true selves, right? Our heart and soul, not just empty rituals.
Absolutely.
It's easy to get caught up in appearances, but the episode reminds us to check our own intentions and make sure they align with our actions.
It seems like hypocrisy is something that's condemned throughout history and across different cultures.
Yeah.
Almost like it violates our understanding of morality and authenticity.
Right.
But the episode doesn't just dwell on the negative. There's this undercurrent of hope woven through the teachings as well.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the theme of embracing truth, which is embodied by the Greek word aletheia.
Yes.
The podcast emphasizes that Jesus is the truth even when he's surrounded by darkness and deception. And I love how Father d-Sawmo uses that quote from John, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it."
It's such a powerful image.
Yeah.
It makes you think, though, what does that mean for us today? In a world that's, overflowing with information and misinformation, how do we navigate towards truth?
Right.
And how do we identify and confront those shadows in our own lives, the areas where we might not be fully truthful with ourselves?
Yeah, it's a constant process of self-reflection, I think.
Yeah.
Looking at our beliefs and our actions and making sure we're living in alignment with the truth. And it's definitely harder than it sounds, but that's where this idea of walking in the light comes in, right?
Exactly. And this idea ties back to the concept of spiritual warfare that Father John brings up early in the episode. It's not enough to just acknowledge the truth, We're called to actively choose it, walk in it, and let it transform our actions.
And the podcast uses such vivid examples from the Gospels to illustrate this. Like when Jesus calls out the Pharisees for demanding signs instead of trusting in God's word, he calls them an apocalypsis, meaning a revelation of their own evil generation.
Wow.
It's a powerful image, right?
Yeah, it is a strong image. It's a reminder that sometimes our need for proof or external validation can actually hold us back in our spiritual growth. True faith often requires a leap of trust.
Absolutely. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about this passage where Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up."
Ooh, good one.
I thought this part was fascinating because it hinges on the Greek word for temple, which is naos.
Right.
And naos refers specifically to the inner sanctuary, the dwelling place of God. So Jesus is proclaiming that he is the true temple, the meeting place between God and humanity. It's like this powerful foreshadowing of his death and resurrection, where he becomes that ultimate bridge between us and the divine.
That is powerful.
Speaking of powerful, there's that section where Father d-Sawmo describes God's love using the Greek word agapesin. And he emphasizes that it's not just any kind of love, but a love that's both sacrificial and unconditional.
It's a love that goes beyond what we can really understand, a love that's willing to give everything for the beloved. And that concept of sacrificial love is woven throughout the entire episode and Passion Week itself.
Yeah, I'm curious though, the podcast uses quite a few Greek terms like agapesin, hypocrisy, anastasis, and koinonia. What's the significance of that?
Well, it's like each word unlocks another layer of meaning and understanding. Take koinonia, for example.
Koinonia really stayed with me. It suggests this deep connection, like a shared life with the divine. Do you think cultivating this koinonia, this close bond with God, is how we tap into a love that's bigger than ourselves? And then we can extend that love outward to others.
That's an interesting thought. Koinonia does suggest a level of closeness and shared experience that goes beyond just, knowing someone. And that feeling of belonging, of being part of something bigger than yourself, could be a source of strength, especially during tough times.
So how does that connect back to agapesin, that sacrificial and unconditional love we were talking about earlier? It seems like a pretty difficult thing to achieve.
It is a high standard.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone does it perfectly. But that's where grace comes in. Remember how the episode starts with Father John talking about spiritual warfare?
Right.
We're not in this fight alone.
Sure.
Christ is our archegos, our pioneer.
He's the one who went through it first. He gets it.
Exactly. And by getting closer to him through prayer or meditation or helping others, we open ourselves up to that divine love. And then it can work through us and touch the people around us.
So it's not about being perfect. It's about making ourselves open to that power, that love that's already there.
I think that's a really beautiful way to put it. And it brings us back to that difference between the Pharisees and Jesus. The Pharisees were all about outward appearances and strictly following the law, but they weren't really connected to God. The podcast uses the word hypocrisy to describe them, but like we said, it's more than just putting on an act. It's a deliberate attempt to deceive, to use things for your own gain.
And Jesus really challenges that way of thinking, doesn't he? He reminds us that true righteousness isn't about following rules without thinking. It's about making sure what's inside us matches what we do. That's where real change happens.
And that alignment takes work. It's not like you fix it once and you're done. It's an ongoing journey of growing and changing. The Passion Tuesday episode acknowledges that struggle, the temptation to choose darkness over light or give in to our selfish desires. It's all part of it.
Which is why anastasis, or resurrection, is such an important theme. It's not just about Jesus rising from the dead. It's about the possibility of new life, of hope and renewal, even after we mess up.
It's a reminder that we can always try again, no matter how many times we fail. And that goes back to why it's so important to search for truth, or aletheia. It's not just about getting information. It's about lining ourselves up with a deeper reality.
Especially now with so much information coming at us all the time, it's easy to feel overwhelmed and lose sight of what truly matters. The podcast hosts encourage us to search the scriptures, for they testify of Christ.
And they use the Greek word eronison, which makes me think of a really deep, thorough investigation. It's about going past a surface-level understanding and really grappling with the text, letting it challenge our assumptions.
I like how this episode and our conversation isn't afraid to look at the hard parts of faith. That whole section where Jesus uses the Greek word way to pronounce woes on the Pharisees and lawyers was pretty intense.
It is intense. Way is like a cry of sadness and warning, trying to get people to turn away from harmful paths. But it's important to remember it's not about judging people. It's about a desire to guide us towards truth and righteousness with compassion.
And those woes weren't just for the people back then, right? We can probably see similar things happening in our own lives and society today.
Absolutely. They make us look at our own hearts and what motivates us. Are we living in a way that lines up with the kingdom of God? Are we putting our own comfort and self-righteousness ahead of others' needs? That's some serious self-reflection.
Yeah. But I think that's what makes this episode so relevant. It's not just about listening to a sermon or learning about history. It's an invitation to really think about our faith and how these ancient teachings can affect our lives today. So much to think about.
For sure. There's so much to unpack here, which makes me wonder, if Jesus came to our world today, what would he think about our culture? What would he say are the modern-day woes?
It's a question that makes you think, what parts of our modern world might make Jesus say, way? Those words of warning and concern. It feels really relevant, especially after we've been talking about hypocrisy and truth and walking in the light.
It does, doesn't it? Especially when we remember how the Pharisees, even though they seemed so religious, they really missed the point when it came to actually living a good life. It makes you wonder if we're doing similar things today. Like, are we falling into the same traps?
Like what kind of things? What would really stand out to Jesus if he was here with us today?
Well, the podcast talked a lot about how the Pharisees were obsessed with appearances and following rules perfectly, but they kind of forgot about the bigger ideas like justice and mercy and faithfulness. Do you think maybe Jesus would call out people who focus more on looking religious than actually being kind and compassionate?
That makes sense. It's like people who talk about tolerance and acceptance but then don't do anything when they see injustice. Or people who say they're super religious but ignore the suffering of others. It feels hypocritical when what you say and what you do don't match up.
Yeah, it does. And that hypocrisy can show up in so many ways, both in our personal lives and in the systems around us. We might say we believe certain things, but then our choices don't reflect those values. Or we might have systems in place that say they're fair, but actually create inequality.
It's like we've gotten really good at keeping things separate in our minds. We can have totally opposite beliefs or do things that go against what we say we believe and not even realize it. It reminds me of when Jesus called the Pharisees blind guides because they couldn't see the truth even though it was right there.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And it feels like we face a similar challenge today. We have so much information thrown at us from all directions that it's hard to know what's true and what's fake. It's easy to get lost in all the noise and drama and demand proof and certainty instead of listening to that quiet voice of truth inside us.
So maybe Jesus would tell us to be more discerning, to really think critically about the information we take in, and to search for truth with open minds and humble hearts.
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah.
It's about not needing constant approval from outside ourselves and learning to trust that inner guide that leads us towards what's right and true.
And maybe, just maybe, part of that means accepting that we don't have all the answers. The Pharisees were so focused on being in control and having everything figured out that they missed out on the beauty of faith, which often means taking a leap of trust and being okay with not knowing everything.
That's a huge insight. And it gets to the heart of what it means to walk in the light, like the podcast talked about. It's not about reaching some perfect state of knowledge or goodness. It's about embracing the fact that we're always growing and discovering and learning how to navigate life's ups and downs with humility and an open heart.
And that's maybe where the true meaning of koinonia comes in, that idea of sharing life with God. It's not about achieving perfect communion or getting rid of all our doubts and uncertainties. It's about learning to walk alongside each other, supporting one another on this journey of faith, remembering that we're all human and we're all in this together.
That's beautifully said.
Yeah.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think that's the message I want us to take away. It's not about beating ourselves up or judging others for our imperfections. It's about embracing the fact that we're constantly becoming better versions of ourselves and trying to live out those values of love, compassion, and truth in everything we do.
And remembering that we're not doing this alone. We have each other. We have these ancient teachings to guide us. And most importantly, we have the love and support of Jesus who walked this path before us.
So as we go from here, let's keep having these tough conversations, questioning what we think we know, and searching for truth with open hearts and minds. And who knows, maybe by doing that, we'll discover a depth of faith and understanding that we never thought possible.